Hello and welcome to this week's blog. It's going to be a long blog this week because we're passing a major milestone in the Living and Learning series. But before we go into that, let me tell you about some other things that have happened this week. Firstly, things are improving very well in terms of the extraction. I'm eating on both sides. I do have pain around here, but mainly it's from where the gums are beginning to go down, and it just feels like a bruise. It only hurts when I touch it, and I touch it occasionally because it's actually itchy, and it's itchy because that's a sign of healing. So the other thing to talk about is the birds. The finches, the owl finches, Sergio and Susie, were brought in about 2 weeks ago to try and see if they would breed. They don't breed wild in the aviary because they can't get to any of the nest boxes because they're sort of pretty much outdone by the zebras. But they weren't breeding within a week. They didn't seem to know what they were doing. I don't know if they're too young. But I gave them a week with nesting material, nest box, nothing. So I put them back out. And I put them back out because I brought in Jojo the Canary. Sorry, not Jojo the Canary, Toby the Canary. I brought in Toby because at the same time that I brought in Sergio and Susie, I noticed that most of my birds were going through a molt, a la the start of autumn, the change in temperature, and that Toby had actually got very thin parts on the back of his neck, so thin they were almost bald, which doesn't happen during a molt. It's a sign of a very sick bird, unless it's a baby, obviously. And during that week it got much worse, so worse that half his head literally was basically bald. And when I did an inspection, I thought, well, one of two things is happening. He's either in a sort of French molt, which is a terribly bad state of affairs for a bird to be in, and that can be really bad if it goes onto their wings and they lose their flight feathers, because sometimes when the molt clears, the feathers don't regrow, and they need certain feathers on their body and on their wings to actually fly, and they can be ground birds forever if that goes wrong. Or he could be being plucked by an aggressive bird, in the aviary. So I removed him, and after a couple of days the feathers were still falling, and so it was obviously not plucking because he'd been segregated. So I took him to the vets, who said, it's not a French molt. She thinks it's a normal molt that's become infected, and it's spreading through the skin, and the skin is basically rejecting all the feathers. So the answer to everything, Baytril, which is the bird antibiotic, Toby was put on to try and get rid of the infection, in the hope that would then solve the skin problem, stop the feather loss, and allow the feathers that had been lost to grow back. And we're at the stage where after a week it certainly isn't getting worse, and it's possibly getting better. There are a lot more pin feathers than they were. I'm going to keep him in obviously until the pin feathers are proper feathers, and until he's definitely finished a course of antibiotics. The City of London is dominated by the livery companies. These are groups of people who formed sort of associations according to their work during the early Middle Ages, practically at the end of the Dark Ages. And there's a worshipful company of almost anything in London, although now, of course, they're much less based on the actual trade that they were originally. This week marks an important milestone. The 1st of October, which this year happens to be a Tuesday, was a Wednesday, in fact, back a decade ago in 2003. And there are two ways in which events that happened on that day completely changed my Annus Horibilis and my future, I suppose. And as you might guess, it's got something to do with the livery companies in London. Do you know, I was working at St Paul's Cathedral and had been for about a month at this point, and it was the first major, and I say major, it wasn't a huge major event, but it was the first event that was slightly out of the ordinary. Every night that I worked, I would do the procession in and out for evensong, and the bits sort of during the service as well. And I'd come to understand how that works. You know, you all formed a queue, you led the queue down a specific path from where they started to where they sat to in the choir stalls. And the major difference for this particular service, which happened to be the choral evensong attended by the Worshipful Company of Musicians. This is the original pamphlet for that event, which I still have 10 years on. This event was different because a lot of the livery company people were attending. It had to be in a larger part. You know, the cathedral would cordon different areas off for different services at different times, and evensong was usually in the choir. People could sit under the dome, but the action took place in the choir, and the choir is collegiate in that you have two sets of people sitting on opposite walls facing each other. Whereas if you were sitting under the dome, for example, you'd have the nave full of chairs facing one way, facing the front. And of course, if you're sitting in the dome facing one way, you are sort of like the third person, really, in a collegiate thing that's going on in the choir, because the area is much smaller, it's much more intimate, and the people are facing each other sort of at close proximity. And that's usually how things went. The destination for the choir was in the choir stalls. But because there were so many people, they weren't all obviously going to fit in the choir, and so things were being hosted under the dome. And this meant that the choir was not going to be sitting in the choir stalls. The choir was going to be sitting on a stand, a made-up, seated, tiered seating, stuck next to the front, next to the sort of under the dome, but to the side, so that they could be seen and heard better, one presumes. There was also, of course, a lot of movement. You know, generally it was one procession in and then one procession out, and this time it was several processions going on at once. There was at least 1, 2, 3, 4 different processions, as is explained on the first sheet, going on at the same time. So my job was to take the choir from where they always started, down one of the aisles that's sort of off limits to the public during these events. We emerge from behind a curtain, walk around the back of the dome, and then we process down as if we were going straight into the choir, but we turned left, and instead we sort of went outside the choir, and that was where they were going to be. There is a profound order to which these things take place. Not just the choreography in terms of time. For example, 1645 remain seated as the masters, prime wardens and clerks of livery companies move from the chapel of St Dunstan to their places under the dome. 1655 at 1658 at 1700. So there's a specific time that these things have to go in. There's also an order for the people inside those processions, and it's very simple. The more important you are, the later you come in the procession, and major increments in VIP status are usually managed with their own verger in front, their own person who's leading them. Obviously, being the most junior, I was leading the whole procession because I was right at the front. I was the least important verger, leading the choir, which was less important than the clergy, and so on. But between myself and the choir come the standards, I suppose. They aren't standards in the sense of being normal flags, but they are standards in the sense that of what they represent. Right behind the verger will come the cross, the big held cross, and either side of it what are known as acolytes, which are basically two gigantic candles. And those were not following me, or they were following me until we got to head towards the choir, and then I turned left to take the choir, which was behind them, to the stand, and they went up and in, which was fine, except that it also had to work in reverse. And this is quite a technical thing, and it was my first major boob. I suppose if you weren't up with the liturgy of the order in which things go, you may not have realised the problem. So on the return, the service was over and it was time to leave. I got up, obviously, the choir got up ready to follow me. Now, as we approached the passing between where we were and the choir, the cross and the acolytes were due to come out of the choir, and they had to slip in a gap between me and the choir, which was fine, except for the fact that we completely mistimed this gap. So instead of it ending up being me, then the cross, then the acolytes, and then the choir, unfortunately there was not enough gap. I was too fast, they were too slow, and the choir just followed me straight round. And so then the cross and lights had to join on, they had to wait and join on at the end. Oh, what a boob. Possibly not something that was huge in the grand scale of boobs, but it was my first major boob, and I will never forget it. Now, up until that point, I had not been drinking alcohol, not been touching alcohol, since the mystery illness, which is the term I used for it at the time, but since the start of all the symptoms back in April. And the reason for that was not because I had been a raging alcoholic before. It was simple. I was told that I was on medication at various different points, and it didn't matter whether it was, prochlorperazine or propranolol or whatever, I shouldn't be mixing them with alcohol, so I didn't. And I had explained that to the people down in the community, the people at St Paul's Cathedral, that I didn't drink because I was basically on permanent medication at that time. I was never a heavy drinker, and some of that was due to my size. The fatter you are, the more it takes to get you intoxicated. The second thing is that when I used to drink, which was mainly during my university years, possibly slightly before, but never after, it cost too much. It just wasn't really worth it. So I used to have the odd drink here and there, but I was never particularly a heavy drinker. Yes, I'd been tipsy a couple of times. I have never been sick with drink, never been sick, and I've never got to the stage where I've either passed out or can't remember what goes on. Never. That night, I was a bit down because of the boob that I'd made, and I decided, why not go down and have a drink with everybody afterwards. And I hadn't eaten very much, and after work, after the big boob, we went down and we had a couple of drinks, and obviously I was not tipsy, but I was a bit unsteady on the way back. I went to sleep that night, and when I woke up the next day, the symptoms of the anxiety had come back in full force. There is a certain amount of crossover with the symptoms which I've already described in videos previously, and in fact being drunk, including dizziness and the inability to walk in a straight line. So my body may have just reacted to that, or it may just have been a sign that, you know, things weren't going to improve, and, you know, there we are. And that is when there was 3 months of depression, clinical depression, actual depression, and it was absolutely horrible. It was really horrible. It was like, because I'd got these symptoms and because they'd come back, I couldn't cope with, I mean, I struggled to cope with them the first time, but this was just a reoccurrence. It was just like, I'll never be free of this. The first thing I did the following day, after letting people know at work, was I spoke to the canon pastor, who was Martin Warner. Martin had one design brief when it came to the lay community, and that was our pastoral welfare, a task which he failed miserably at. But nevertheless, you know, he had assured me when I explained to him about this, I explained to him the whole lot. He told me that there was nothing, you know, there was no problem, and that, you know, just keep on with things and just let him know what I decided with doctors and stuff like that. There was no concern about my ability to do the job. There was no concern, you know, about my ability of functioning within the community, you know, and basically he was there to support me, and everybody would support me and everything would be fine. And that's really important, because that's disputed by a lot of people, including himself, the following year. But I want to set that on the record and say absolutely that happened. And so I pretty much vowed from that day on that I wasn't going to, certainly wasn't going to drink again, ever. I don't know if I blamed the drink for setting it off again, or if it was just too connected, but that was it. And, you know, even when I started feeling better the following year, I never touched a drop, and I haven't since. It's been 10 years, or it will have been 10 years ago, middle of this next week, since I last had alcohol.